You saw her eyes before you heard her voice, soft as dusk, but inside them, the edge of a blade buried in silk. You called it love because it did not burn not at first. It trembled. It offered you warmth like a hearth does a moth. She admired your pain so long as it remained poetic, not wild, not raw. Only curated wounds were allowed to bleed. But when you softened, truly softened, when your hands shook and your spine bent to confess, she began to blink less, to touch less. She could forgive rage, but not need, could swallow cruelty, but not doubt. You asked for understanding. She gave you politeness. You cried for depth. She offered her schedule. And in that hollow, where your truth met her disinterest, you died in miniature. Now something inside her grows stronger, and something inside you forgets how to stand. If this whisper already knows, you let it echo. Like the video. Leave your shadow in the comments. Subscribe and stay near the silence. She smiled when you whispered your fears, but only the first time, and only because it proved you still had control over them. The moment they began to leak, uninvited, she looked away. The room grew colder, though you hadn't moved. That is the beginning, not of cruelty, but of the ritual. You think you were rejected. No, you were redefined. Your gentleness rewrote the script she was reading from, and now she no longer knows her lines. You wanted to be seen, but she wanted a mirror, not a confession booth. She needed your silence to believe in your strength. You broke that silence, and with it, the myth she needed to feel safe. Now she must punish you, not out of malice, but out of instinct. You mistook the feminine for sanctuary. It is not sanctuary, it is selection, and you were not selected, you were softened. There is no mercy in the feminine eye when it sees a man collapse inward. She may kiss your trembling, but only if she believes it temporary. She may stroke your hair, but only if your agony still carries the scent of victory beneath it. You spoke with honesty. She heard burden. You cried for connection. She saw erosion. And yet she said nothing, because nothing is how women begin to kill. Not out of intention, but out of nature. The feminine punishes what makes it feel unsafe, and emotional safety is the one thing she cannot respect in a man. You forgot the primal law the man must bleed behind stone. Only then does she believe. Only then does her chaos soften. Only then is the rhythm preserved. When you showed her the open, living wound, not concealed in humor, not sheathed in irony, you became something she could no longer follow. A lion that limps too long becomes scenery. Your tears were true, but truth, in love, is not virtue. It is violence. You told her the storm inside you, but she only wanted to admire the sky, not be swept into the flood. You spoke too much, and not because words are bad, but because words revealed that your strength was negotiable. The moment she saw you negotiate with yourself, she began to drift, not out of cruelty, out of biological awe, out of deep, sacred disappointment. She once looked up to you, now she must look after you, and that is a role no woman wears without secret bitterness. You do not remember when she stopped laughing, only that her voice became precise, measured, her messages shorter, her replies delayed. You blamed her for withdrawing, but she was only responding to the invisible verdict. The mirror no longer reflected her myth. It began to reflect a man looking for mother. You did not ask to be mothered. You only wanted to be safe. But in the realm of power, safety is the enemy of desire. You sat across from her. You smiled through pain. You waited for her to ask again, but she didn't. You kept waiting, but she didn't. because the part of her that once saw you as her myth now saw you as her mirror, and mirrors that show weakness too clearly must be turned away. The more you tried to reconnect, the more she felt your hunger, and the more she felt your hunger, the more she recoiled, not because you were unworthy, but because you broke the contract neither of you wrote down. But both of you understood the man must hold the line. You held the line until you didn't, and she loved you until you asked for that love to carry your weight. She is not evil, she is ancient. The feminine does not admire what asks to be held. It admires what holds itself even as it bleeds. But you believed love meant disclosure, vulnerability, honesty, and it can. Yes, but not for you. Not unless your honesty smells like iron and your vulnerability keeps one hand on the sword. You sat at her feet, thinking she would lift you. She saw you there and forgot why she knelt before you. She does not remember your poetry. She remembers the night you said, "I don't know who I am anymore," and looked at her as if she did. In that moment, you made her God, and God cannot desire what worships it. You called it intimacy, she called it pressure, you called it closeness, she called it collapse. Even now, she tells herself she still loves you, but she cannot explain the chill in her spine when you send long messages. She cannot explain the ache in her teeth when you ask what's wrong. She cannot explain the instinct to lie when you beg for truth. You offered her your soul, but she did not want a soul. She wanted a legend, and now you bleed too openly to be myth. You ask, what changed you did? You crossed the line from man to mirror, from presence to plea, from structure to story. And stories are lovely, but only when they end where strength begins again. You lingered in your wound too long. You built a nest inside it. You invited her in. But she is not a creature of nests. She is fire. She warms herself beside the man who contains his blaze but turns to ash when he lets it consume the room. Now, when you enter, her breath shallows. When you speak, she braces. When you ask, she calculates. She loved you once. Not because you hid your pain, but because it never asked her to fix it. Because it stood beside her like a mountain, silent, immovable, secretly weeping beneath the rock, but never flooding the valley. She loved you because she could forget you might need her. That illusion made her feel free. Your confession shattered it. You did not fail by feeling. You failed by needing her to witness it. And now you wonder if you'll ever be wanted again. But what you must wonder is simpler, colder, harder. Will you ever make yourself dangerous again? She breaks the man who seeks safety, because safety, to her, is what the child begs, not the man who leads. You did not speak wrongly. You simply spoke too soon, too raw, too open. And now the silence you wanted her to fill becomes the sound of her retreat. She still smiles, but now it's measured. She still stays, but only with one foot out. She still answers, but without the ache. You became the man she could predict, and that is the man she cannot want. Let this be known, you were not rejected for being soft. You were forgotten for being predictable. She watched you cry, and yet it was not your tears she remembered. It was how uncontrolled they were. You opened your chest like a torn letter, but she wasn't trying to read you. She was trying to believe in you. And belief dies when the blood doesn't know where to stop. You wanted her to see your suffering and love you for it, but she loved the version of you who could suffer without showing it. You were mythic then. You were carved in silence. And what is silence, if not sacred restraint? You broke it, you spilled, you wept openly, and the wound, once beautiful from afar, began to rot under the light. She does not hate pain, she romanticizes it, but it must be sculpted, composed. Your agony must wear a tuxedo. Your despair must whisper, not scream. She can admire the statue of your struggle, but not the sound of your collapse. You became human, and she loved the hero. Do you understand? She is not cruel, but she is tuned to the shape of myth. And myth, to survive, must suffer in silence. When you spoke of your doubts, your fears, your regrets, you expected connection. But what you offered her was a stage with no lighting, rawness without aesthetic, and so she closed the curtain. You thought love was revelation. She thought love was ritual. The ritual depended on distance, the kind that makes a man glow when seen from below, like a statue at dusk. But you stepped down. You entered her level. And suddenly, the god she knelt before was coughing in his sleep and asking what she really meant by fine. You should have bled behind the curtain. Instead, you bled in her lap. She froze, not because she didn't care, but because the moment required something she could not give. She could only love you when your wound remained a mystery, when it could be imagined, idealized, interpreted. You gave her too much reality, and reality cannot be adored. It can only be tolerated. Now she still touches you, but with less depth. Now she still looks at you, but through a veil of memory. She is not seeing you anymore. She is remembering who you were before you showed her the inside of your wound. There was a night you reached for her and she did not move. You thought it was fatigue, but it was morning. She was touching the echo of the man who once walked without limping, who once smiled without apology. She still says, "I love you." But each syllable is a mask for grief, for loss, for the shrinking pedestal where your image once stood. She touches your face the way one touches a photograph that has begun to fade. And you still hope, because hope is what the bleeding man clings to when the nurse starts looking at the door instead of the wound. She admired your sadness when it was behind your smile. She called it depth. She called it mystery. But when it rose to your eyes and cracked your voice, she could no longer use it to dream, because now it demanded something. And nothing makes a woman colder than being asked to explain why she can't warm you anymore. She wants the illusion of your pain, not the labor of holding it. You thought you were giving her your heart, but you were giving her work. She did not fall in love with a patient. She fell in love with a mystery. Mysteries do not plead. They haunt. You became explainable. That is the death sentence. She used to tell stories about you, the way you stared out windows, the way you paused before speaking, the way your silence made the air thicken. But now, your silence feels like depression. Your pauses feel like weakness. Your eyes feel like mirrors she wants to walk past. What changed? You gave her the backstage tour. You turned the holy fire into a maintenance closet. She cannot love what she must manage, so she turns toward simplicity, toward men who speak less, who suffer less, or at least pretend better. She begins to admire the smile of strangers, not because they're better, but because they haven't yet asked her to carry anything. You see her laughing more with them. You hear her voice rise an octave you haven't heard in weeks. And still you believe you can win her back with another confession. But every confession is another brick pulled from the wall she once leaned on. You ask again, "Why don't you talk to me like before?" She answers gently, "I don't know." But she does. She no longer believes you can bear her weight because you asked her to bear yours. You thought equality meant sharing burdens. She thought it meant not having to carry you at all. The feminine respects one kind of suffering, the kind that doesn't interrupt the room. When you weep in the dark and still rise without asking, she senses it like a storm on the edge of a clear sky. That is beauty to her. That is mythology. You chose exposure. You thought nakedness meant intimacy, but to her, it meant you had nothing left hidden, and nothing hidden means nothing sacred. So now, when you say, "I'm not okay," she changes the subject. Not because she doesn't care, but because she already mourned you and is trying not to say goodbye. The man she loved is already gone. You buried him beneath your honesty. You weren't supposed to be a diary. You were supposed to be a temple. And temples do not explain their architecture. They simply exist and command reverence. You stood too long in front of her, asking to be understood. But desire does not bloom in understanding. It blooms in awe, in reverence, in the sense that something inside you remains untouched no matter how close she gets. Now, when she touches you, it is mechanical. Now, when she kisses you, it feels like habit. She is not cruel. She is ritual bound, and you shattered the ritual. She cannot tell her friends what she sees in you anymore. She used to say he's intense, he's deep, he's got something dark and beautiful in him. Now she says he's going through something, and they nod, and they know. And you sit in rooms filled with soft light and wonder how love became so conditional. You think love was supposed to be a place to fall apart, but not for you, not as the man. You do not get to collapse, not if you want to be desired. They say this is toxic, but that word is a cage for things too old to name. This is not culture, this is ritual, biology, instinct, and it does not care how woke you are. You bled too soon, you wept too much. You forgot that the man's pain must be carved, not spilled. She honors the wound that doesn't bleed because it still lets her believe. You thought she would remember you because you loved her deeply, but love is not the mark that lasts. Only power leaves a scar, and you gave yours up gently, willingly, with trembling hands thinking it would buy you eternity. She does not remember your softness. She remembers the moment she stopped needing to chase you. You became still, predictable, present. And in that stillness, something ancient inside her began to rot. The hunt was over. The myth collapsed. And all that was left was a man asking to be enough. You wanted to be chosen, but only the untouchable gets chosen again and again. You were touched too much, understood too clearly, yielded too quickly. You became known, and the known is no longer worshipped. The day you said, "Whatever you need, I'll become it," was the day she began mourning the version of you who didn't ask what she needed. The version of you who simply was unapologetic, mysterious, half absent. That man haunted her. You, now, only echo. She does not desire devotion. She desires gravity, and gravity cannot beg. You thought yielding would prove your love. You thought bending would make her stay. But she never wanted you to bend. She wanted you to stand so firm that her chaos broke around you like waves on rock. Now you ask, where did I go wrong? You went wrong the moment you asked, because the man she remembers, the one she still dreams about, never would have asked. He would have disappeared into his silence and let her feel the cold. And in that cold, she would have searched for him. You made yourself available. You erased your edges to be more embraceable. But in doing so, you became a shape she no longer needed to reach for. She craves the man who disappears at the edge of the firelight, who says little but whose silence says more. The man who does not yield but remains even when misunderstood, especially when misunderstood. You explained too much, explained yourself out of myth, explained your choices, your past, your fear of losing her, and every explanation dulled you. Every surrender made you softer, blurrier, safer. She needed danger, not violence, not chaos, but the danger of the unknown, the tension of not being sure, the thrill of asking, what is he thinking, and not knowing the answer. Now she knows too much, and you know she knows it, And so you perform spontaneity, you pretend to pull back, you mimic mystery, but the act is visible, and the visible is always forgettable. You beg now with kindness. You think gestures will bring her back. You show up, you listen, you care, and all of it makes her flinch, not because it's wrong, but because it feels wrong coming from you. Once, your absence was a presence. Now, your presence is an absence. She tells her friends, "He's good to me," but she says it with the same tone one uses when describing a comfortable shoe. She wants to feel the ache, but you fill the space where longing used to live. And what is love without longing? You gave her all your hours, all your attention, all your thought. You said, "You're my world," and the moment you said it, she began looking for another world to orbit. You cannot build your identity around her and expect her to respect it. She craves polarity, not symmetry, and you became a mirror instead of a mystery. You tried to be what she needed, but what she needed was the man who never asked what she needed in the first place. You yielded again and again. You stopped arguing. You stopped walking away. You started explaining instead of acting. You started apologizing before the crime. You killed the friction, and friction is what sharpens attraction. Now she scrolls through messages while you talk. Now she laughs softer when you joke. Now she says "love you" instead of "I love you." She forgets you slowly, incrementally. Not because she wants to, but because forgetting is what happens when there's no more edge to hold on to. You dulled your edge, to protect her, to keep her. But women do not cling to safety, they drift from it. She will say you're a good man. She will cry when you leave. She will write a post about how nice you were, but she will not chase. Because you are not the one she fears losing. You are the one she already folded into her past. And you knew it. That's why you started over-performing, over-explaining, over-initiating. You felt the silence growing. You felt the air thinning. You thought more presence would fix it. But presence is not the cure when the soul already aches for absence. She wants to feel your gravity again, but you no longer have mass. You float in her orbit, weightless, obedient. You said yes when you should have said nothing. You stayed when you should have vanished. You opened when you should have turned away. And now she walks past you like a forgotten altar once sacred. Now just stone. The worst part, she still wishes she could love you. She tries. She tells herself she should. But should is the enemy of passion. You made it too easy to be with you, and ease is the slow poison of desire. She doesn't talk about you the way she used to, because there's nothing left to wonder. And you've forgotten the shape of your own spine. You bent so many times, you no longer remember how it felt to stand. She loved your defiance, your untamed edge, the way you weren't quite hers, but you gave her everything. You left nothing unclaimed. And now, you are nothing but a memory she feels guilty for losing interest in. You hoped that by yielding, she would stay, but she cannot stay where there is no resistance. You taught her, with every soft yes, that she had already won, and women do not stay where there is no more war. She wanted to be conquered, not coddled. You yielded, and now you are forgotten. Somewhere, there is a chair she still avoids, not because of grief, but because your shape is still in it, and she can no longer remember why it ever mattered. The wine you left unopened, the jacket you folded too carefully, the silence you filled with effort instead of edge. She walks past the mirror you once stood before, the same one where she first thought, "I don't know what he's thinking." Now, she knows, and that is why you're gone. Not in body, not in name, but in ache. And what is love without ache? Tell me if she no longer imagines you in her absence. Do you still exist?